Hey everybody, welcome to lecture 4.1, America and the Road to World War II. I'm using basically three books to kind of go through these lectures about World War II. Freedom from Fear, we've kind of been going through that with the Great Depression. FDR's biography by Gene Edward Smith. And then I've got a general history of World War II. It's by the military historian John Keegan, and it's just called The Second World War, so it's a great overview of World War II. Now, in his book, John Keegan writes, the Second World War was, quote, the largest single event in human history, fought across 6 of the world's 7 continents and all of its oceans. It killed 50 million human beings, left hundreds of millions of others wounded in mind or body, and materially devastated much of the heartland of civilization. Now, the causes of the Second World War were many. The settlement after World War I, the weakness of the League of Nations, the rise of dictators, international aggression, and mistakes and missed opportunities made by the democracies between the years 1919 and 1939. Now, to start off with, Germany, Japan, and Italy, those are the 3 Axis powers in World War II. They were all frustrated with the outcome of the Paris Peace Conference. Italy was upset because she was denied territories promised to her in a secret treaty made during World War I. She did not get the promised territories after World War I, and her Prime Minister, Vittorio Orlando, left the Paris Peace Conference and went back home. Italy was plunged into social and political chaos. Japan was upset that an anti-racism clause was rejected as part of the Covenant of the League of Nations. You know, Japan wanted to be regarded as Europe's equal. Japan had also gotten a smaller share of the spoils than they thought they were entitled to. Germany was the most upset by the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. The blame for World War I was placed solely upon her shoulders by the victors. Germany was stripped of her colonies. Some of her territory was divided up and given to her European neighbors, which resulted in her population being reduced. She was reduced to having an army of 100,000 men. The size of her navy was limited. She was to have no air force and no submarines. The Rhineland was to be demilitarized. She was forbidden from having a union with Austria. Lastly, she was saddled with the financial burden of the Great War, which was $32 billion. If she made all her payments on time, she would finish paying off these reparations in 1983. Though the League of Nations was formed, it would be weak and ineffectual in dealing with the international aggression that occurred during the 1930s. America, the Soviet Union, and Germany, for a time, would not be members of the League. It would be difficult to keep the peace internationally with 2 of the world's greatest powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, absent from the scene. And the rise of dictators throughout the 1920s and 30s kind of helped lead to World War II as well. Now, those 3 nations that become the Axis powers in World War II, Japan, Italy, and Germany, they all kind of went on kind of an aggressive streak during the 1930s that led to World War II. The first international challenge came from Japan. Following the Meiji Restoration in 1868, Japan had industrialized and was by far the most powerful Asian nation. However, Japan was suffering from the Great Depression. They felt that they needed living space in China. China had been a poverty-stricken, kind of seemingly ungovernable nation that was ruled by warlords and torn by civil wars and banditry. In 1931, the Kwantung Army, that was the Japanese army stationed in Manchuria, they staged an attack on the Manchurian Railway and blamed the Chinese for this. This incident was known as the Mukden Incident, and it gave the Japanese military an excuse to conquer all of Manchuria and set up a puppet state called Manchukuo. Now, China did appeal to the League of Nations, and the Earl of Lytton was sent to investigate. He did conclude that the incident was manufactured by the Japanese and that their invasion of Manchuria was not a legitimate use of self-defense. Japan reacted by walking out of the League of Nations. In 1937, following a clash between Japanese soldiers and Chinese soldiers on the Marco Polo Bridge, Japan would use Manchuria to invade the rest of China. This was the beginning of World War II in Asia, this invasion of China in 1937. In a matter of months, the Japanese conquered China, capturing their major cities and ports. The rape of Nanking, one of the worst atrocities of the war, followed, in which the Japanese committed brutal atrocities against Chinese civilians. They killed some 200 to 300,000 Chinese in this orgy of violence. There were killings by bayonet stabbings, beheadings, machine gunning, starvation. Japanese soldiers photographed their actions, and pictures exist of Japanese soldiers beheading their victims with samurai swords, stabbing women in the vagina, tossing babies up in the air and skewering them with their bayonets. There's stories about these things going on. Some of the worst atrocities of World War II were committed against the Chinese. Now, Italy also went on an aggressive campaign in the 1930s. Benito Mussolini came to power in 1922, and he did much to solve the problems faced by Italy after World War I. He brought law and order to a chaotic nation. He stopped the strikes. He got the factories running again. He gave people jobs on public works. Most famously, he made the trains run on time. He increased Italy's birth rate, which had been in decline for some time. He did this by taxing bachelors and rewarding mothers who had children. Italian women competed for the honor of associated with providing Italy with the next generation. This was referred to as the battle for births. Mussolini was referred to as the Dukes or Duce. He was seen as a national role model. Mussolini really knew how to appeal to the nation. He was a master at propaganda. He often had himself filmed shirtless, pitching hay, wrestling with lion cubs, or skiing. Mussolini also consolidated his hold on power by ending freedom of the press and assembly. He created a one-party state and arrested political opponents. His most famous quotes are "Everything within the state, nothing outside the state," and "Better one day as a lion than 100 years as a sheep." In an attempt to recreate the glories of the ancient Roman Empire, Mussolini invaded Ethiopia in 1935. Though Italian troops had modern weapons, they at first stumbled against the much lesser well-equipped Ethiopians, led by the Emperor Haile Selassie. Ethiopia appealed to the League of Nations, but the League's condemnation and limited sanctions did nothing to stop Italy. By 1936, Italy had succeeded in conquering Ethiopia. Ethiopian rifles and spears were no match for machine guns, bombs, and poison gas. Now, the most important cause of World War II was Adolf Hitler. He had been a soldier in World War I and was recovering from a poison gas attack in a hospital when he learned of Germany's surrender in the Great War. In the 1920s, Hitler became the leader of a socialist party in Germany, the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or Nazi Party. Hitler attempted to overthrow the Bavarian government in his 1923 beer hall putsch. Now, this failed and Hitler was sent to prison. Although he was allowed to receive visitors, he had a comfortable cell, and he was allowed to write his book Mein Kampf. Now, in that book, he railed against the Treaty of Versailles and the stab in the back that cost Germany what he thought was their victory in World War I. Hitler railed against the Jews as well. He also discussed the need for Lebensraum, or living space, in the East so that Germans could continue to grow as a people. Hitler may have been relegated to the ash heap of history had it not been for the Great Depression, but that event did catapult him to the chancellorship in 1933. He soon used national emergencies such as the Reichstag fire in 1933 to crush his opponents. He later made himself dictator in Germany, taking the title of Führer, or leader. Hitler took a number of steps to undo the Treaty of Versailles and restore Germany to what he thought was her rightful place among the nations. In 1933, he withdrew Germany from the League of Nations. In 1935, he announced that Germany would rearm. In 1936, he reoccupied and militarized the Rhineland. Later in 1936, he signed the Rome-Berlin Axis with Mussolini and the Anti-Comintern Pact with Japan. In 1938, he annexed Austria. Later that year, Hitler succeeded in getting the Western democracies to cave in his effort to incorporate the Sudetenland into Germany. Now, the Sudetenland was a part of Czechoslovakia that was made up of mostly German inhabitants. Hitler believed that they belonged in Germany. In what became known as appeasement, the British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler 3 times in 1938, the last time culminating in something called the Munich Conference. And Chamberlain gave Hitler the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise not to use aggression in any other territorial disputes in Europe. This promise, a piece of paper, is what Chamberlain famously held up on his return to England, saying that he had maintained peace in their time. In the Sudetenland, Hitler got 3.5 million new Germans and large coal deposits. Czechoslovakia lost their best frontier defense. In March 1939, Hitler broke his promise and invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia. The conquest of Czechoslovakia marked a turning point in the balance of power in Europe. Czechoslovakia had a strong military and wanted to fight Hitler, but they were forced to stand down the previous year when she was told by the Western democracies at Munich that the Sudetenland was going to be handed over to Hitler. Now the Czechs' tanks, airplanes, weapons, munitions industries would be used by the Wehrmacht, the German military machine, for their future invasions. After Hitler gobbled up Czechoslovakia, the Western democracies threw appeasement aside and decided to take a stand. The British and the French, who believed Poland would be Hitler's next target, gave Poland a guarantee of independence. The British and the French sent an envoy to Moscow to try and form a defense against Hitler by allying with the Soviets, but they failed in this mission. The Western democracies had caved to Hitler throughout the 1930s, and as a result of that, Stalin had calculated that he could not count on them as allies. Stalin, he was the dictator of the Soviet Union. He came to power in the mid to late 1920s after the death of Vladimir Lenin. Stalin felt that Russia needed time to prepare for a war, which he thought was inevitable, so he sought an understanding with Hitler to buy time for his country. The result was the Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, which was signed in August 1939. Under this agreement, Hitler and Stalin agreed not to attack each other. They opened up trade with one another. Germany got oil and raw materials from Russia. The Russians got technical training and weapons from Germany. There was also a secret clause in which Hitler and Stalin agreed to carve up Poland between the two of them. Stalin would also get the Baltic states, Finland, and Romania. On September 1st, 1939, after initiating a false flag attack against a German radio station on the Polish frontier, Hitler invaded Poland. Now this was the start of World War II in Europe, this 1939 invasion of Poland. Hitler crushed Poland with his Blitzkrieg or lightning war. Blitzkrieg used quick movements by armor and air units to strike past and overrun a nation's frontier in defense. Then the infantry forces would move in and consolidate the attack, quickly defeating or capturing the confused and stunned enemy armies. Now, the democracies made a number of mistakes that kind of allowed World War II to happen. They could have stopped the aggressors in the 1930s if they had wanted to, but they believed, the Allies did, that World War I had started because the great powers let a localized conflict get out of hand. Each of the great powers, not wanting to lose the advantages that came with quick mobilization, had done just that, mobilized quickly for war. War ended up following, and it grew beyond any of the great powers' ability to control it. With that lesson in mind, the Allies in the interwar years did not want to jump the gun by resorting to military measures to stop Germany, Japan, or Italy, but that fear actually led to World War II. Another mistake made by the Allies was that they were fighting the last war. World War I had been a war in which the machine gun and artillery had made the offensive impossible. World War I was a static war of no movements and trench warfare. The Allies prepared for that type of war again, a war in which the initiative belonged to the defender. That's kind of one of the lessons of history. Don't prepare for the last war, think about the next war. And that's what Hitler did. Hitler's Blitzkrieg tactics had restored the initiative to the attacker. Hitler understood how technology had changed tactics, but the Allies hadn't. After defeating Poland, something strange happened. Germany, France, and Great Britain just kind of waited. There was no fighting on the Western Front. On the Eastern Front, Russia invaded Finland, where they soon became bogged down in a quagmire with the ferocious Finnish army. In the West, a phony war settled in, so nothing goes on. But then in the spring and summer of 1940, Hitler began his conquest of the West, and soon Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg fell. France was next to fall. In June of 1940, in the same railway car that the Germans had signed the armistice ending World War I, Hitler accepted the surrender of the French. So now in the West, only Great Britain stands against Hitler. So that's kind of the situation in Europe and Asia. Now let's kind of look at how America is going on, what's going on in America during this period. Because of our history, geography, and the experience of World War I, Americans would be an isolationist nation throughout the 1920s and much of the 1930s. However, FDR would often be ahead of public opinion. When war broke out, FDR gave a fireside chat on September 3rd, 1939, so that's 2 days after the war starts. And here's what he said.
this nation will remain a neutral nation. But I cannot ask that every American remain neutral in thought as well. Even a neutral has a right to take account of facts. Even a neutral cannot be asked to close his mind or to close his conscience.
Now, FDR felt that the best way for America to stay out of World War II was to aid the democracies in Europe fighting Hitler and the nationalist forces in China fighting the Japanese. In his mind, it made more sense for America to provide the finances and material, while Europe and Asia provided the fighting men. But it would be a long road for America to travel, and it would take a surprise attack by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor before America was willing to get into the war. In the early 1930s, when Japan invaded Manchuria, Herbert Hoover was still president. America decided not to recognize the puppet state of Manchu Kuo, but they also sought not to sanction Japan for her invasion of China. This policy was known as the Stimson Doctrine. It was named after Hoover's Secretary of State, Henry Stimson. In the early 1930s, America was more focused on the Western Hemisphere. FDR implemented this policy called the Good Neighbor Policy, by which America sought better relations with her Latin American neighbors. America renounced the use of military force and armed intervention in Latin America. In 1934, the Congress repealed the Platt Amendment that had been that relic from the Spanish-American War that said America could intervene in Cuba if it felt it needed to. FDR did take a big step in foreign affairs when he became president. He recognized diplomatically the Soviet Union in 1933. Up to that point, the U.S. had refused to recognize the Soviet Union. A lot of other nations had done so. FDR basically felt it was time to recognize the Soviet Union. He thought maybe we can get some good trade deals with the Soviet Union. And also, he saw the Soviet Union as a buffer to the Japanese empire, to the ambitions of the Japanese. Now, despite FDR's internationalist leanings, the American public remained firmly in the isolationist camp. Many Americans felt that intervening in World War I had been a mistake. After all, weren't the European nations right back where they had started? What difference did American intervention make then, they asked. Isolationism was strongest in the Midwest, which was home to millions of immigrants from Europe. Many immigrants to the Midwest had sought to get away from the militarism of Europe. They were worried that despite fleeing Europe, World War II was going to drag them right back into the Europe squabbles. I got some quotes here to kind of show you how people felt. The Democrat governor of Pennsylvania, George Earle, in 1935, he said this: "Let us turn our eyes inward. If the world is to become a wilderness of waste, hatred, and bitterness, let us all the more earnestly protect and preserve our own oasis of liberty." Minnesota Senator Thomas Shaw exclaimed in 1935, "To hell with Europe and the rest of those nations." America was so strongly isolationist that there was a movement in the 1930s to pass something called the Ludlow Amendment. It was a proposed amendment to the Constitution that would require a national referendum for a declaration of war. Now, this didn't apply in the case of invasion, but it would take the American people voting nationally to go to war. Now, it did fail to pass in January 1938, but just barely. Many Americans also felt that while the war was bad for the average American citizen, the war had benefited bankers and munition makers. In 1934, Republican Senator Gerald Nye of South Dakota held hearings to investigate the merchants of death. Now, the merchants of death were those bankers, munitions traders, and European business interests who had dragged America into World War I just for their profits. The Nye Committee investigated these so-called merchants of death. There was even a book written in 1934 by the title Merchants of Death. Now, I want to show you a clip from a movie called The President Vanishes. This is also from the year 1934, and it portrays the merchants of death as greedy businessmen hungry for war.
I don't like evasions. There's too much of that stuff going on right now. All right, then, let's get down to business. Munitions is our business, and it's up to us to make it America's business. What good are steel and shell and shrapnel if there's nothing to shoot at? There's too much sentimental talk about the last war. What did it really cost us? 400,000 casualties. Nothing. It gave us the greatest year of prosperity any nation's ever had. But that war is worn out. There's another one in Europe now. And every minute we delay getting into it is costing us $1 million.
As a matter of fact, all we need is a good slogan.
Country's honor. There's your perfect slogan.
Gigantic.
That's just what we need.
With blast to the country.
Superb.
The lifeblood of America.
Save your country's honor.
Save our industries.
Save
Why,
our
save this country. And you prosperity, the word I really do mean. Save your country's honor. The iron in
Okay, as a result of this sentiment, throughout the 1930s, Congress passed and FDR signed a series of neutrality acts that were meant to keep America out of war. There are 5 neutrality acts in all, from 1935 to 1939. The first Neutrality Act in 1935, it prohibited the export of arms, ammunition, and implements of war from the United States to foreign nations at war, and it also stated that Americans traveling in war zones did so at their own risk. You know, we don't want a repeat of the Lusitania in World War II. The Neutrality Act of 1936, it kept all the provisions in place previously, but it also prohibited Americans from extending any loans or credits to nations at war. So, you know, in World War I, we got dragged in, so it was thought, because we wanted the Allies to win because we had loaned them so much money. So let's just not loan anybody money that's at war, and then we won't have a reason to root for one side or the other. In 1937, another Neutrality Act was passed. It was actually a joint resolution in response to the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. There's a civil war going on in Spain from 1936 to 1939, so they just applied the Neutrality Acts to that conflict. Later on, there's another Neutrality Act in 1937. It kept all the previous laws in effect, but it also forbade American citizens from traveling on belligerent ships. It forbade American merchant ships from transporting arms to belligerents. It gave the president the authority to bar belligerents from U.S. waters and to extend the embargo to other materials. Most importantly, though, it established something known as cash carry. Now, under cash carry, belligerent nations could, with the president's discretion, purchase raw materials but no arms from the United States, as long as they paid for those materials in cash and provided non-American ships to transport the materials back to their own country. So they have to pay in cash, and they have to take the goods back to their country on their own ships. This was meant to help Britain and France, because they're the only nation that can really come to America. Japan could also do this, I guess, but it was meant to help Britain and France mainly. So basically, all of these neutrality acts are meant to prevent us getting dragged into World War II. Now, American isolationist sentiment was so strongly against the war that not even the beliefs of FDR, who's a very popular president, or direct attacks by the enemy could change their sentiment. In October 1937, FDR gave a speech in Chicago. Chicago is considered the home of isolationism. This speech was known as the quarantine speech, and FDR said this in the quarantine speech.
War is a contagion, whether it be declared or undeclared. It can engulf states and peoples remote from the original scene of hostilities. And mark this well, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients. America hopes for peace. Therefore, America actively engages in the search for peace.
In January 1939, in his growing conviction that the fate of Europe mattered to America, FDR made a comment in a private meeting that, quote, "the safety of the Rhine frontier does necessarily interest us." Now, this quote was leaked to the press, and basically the newspapers say, you know, FDR says America's frontier is on the Rhine, but despite the quarantine speech and FDR's statement that America's frontier is the Rhine, Americans still didn't want anything to do with World War II. When the USS Panay, an American gunboat on the Yangtze River in China, was bombed and attacked by the Japanese in December 1937, the Americans didn't care. This sinking killed 2 people. The American response was not kind of indignation at Japan. It was kind of a collective, what the heck is an American ship doing on the Yangtze River in China? Japan did apologize and paid America for the incident, and it was kind of left at that. Now, FDR does work to sway the American public to kind of help the Allies fighting against Hitler and Japan. In his State of the Union address in January 1939, so this is before the war breaks out, FDR pushed to have the neutrality laws repealed. He warned that, quote, storms from abroad directly challenge religion. There comes a time in the affairs of men when they must prepare to defend not their homes alone, but the tenets of faith and humanity on which their churches, their government, and their very civilization are founded. The defense of religion, of democracy, and of good faith among nations is all the same fight. To serve one, we must now make up our minds to save one, we must now make up our minds to save all. According to FDR, there were many methods short of war that America might use to aid the Allies. FDR believed that America could supply the finances and material forces fighting totalitarianism. So that's his method short of war. Let's provide the material to win the war without providing the manpower. Now, in addition to isolationist sentiment, keeping America out of war, the American armed forces were also so small that kept America from really having a say in what happened in the wars in Europe and Asia. The American military was actually very small and underfunded. I want you to watch this clip of American men training with cardboard cutouts.
Commanding 70,000 troops of the First Army, General Hugh A. Drum denounces an arms shortage that forces fill with wooden weapons, but points out that Germany, before rearming, trained millions with pasteboard cannon and make-believe machines.
As one international crisis followed another, America began to look at its sadly neglected defenses. The army was smaller than Romania's. It numbered 227,000 men, but there was equipment for only a third of them.
There is far to go. And with each silent non-firing of the non-loaded trench mortar guns, there is explosive appeal for speed in making this nation strong.
There was a famous confrontation between Douglas MacArthur, the Army Chief of Staff, and FDR over the size of the American military. FDR actually shrank the American military when he became president. So this is what MacArthur said to the president, FDR. He said, "I spoke recklessly and said something to the effect that when we lost the next war and an American boy lying in the mud with an enemy bayonet through his belly and an enemy foot on his dying throat spat out his last curse, I wanted the name not to be MacArthur but Roosevelt." Now FDR got mad at MacArthur for saying this and said, "You can't talk to the president this way," and MacArthur ran outside and threw up. He was so nervous about confronting the president. Now, to pursue this method short of war policy, FDR had to get the Neutrality Acts canceled. He failed in that, but he did get them amended. The Neutrality Act of November 1939, so this is a month after Hitler has invaded, or a couple months after Hitler has invaded Poland, they do change the Neutrality Acts. They lift the arms embargo to nations at war. So basically, this applies to Europe because Japan and China aren't technically at war. That conflict was being called an incident at the time. Even though it was a war, everyone referred to it as the incident in China. So this canceling of the arms embargo basically applies to Europe. Now, it did restore the cash carry provision that had previously expired. So if Britain or France wanted weapons, they would have to come get them in their own ships and they would have to pay for them in cash. It still forbade Americans, either the U.S. Treasury, the federal government, or bankers from loaning money to the belligerents. And it forbade American merchant ships from transiting a broad danger zone that embraced most of the sea lanes to the Western European countries. Now, nonetheless, this was a success for Roosevelt. He could now sell weapons to the British who are fighting against Hitler. So in 1940 and 1941, FDR would ramp up the aid given to Britain against Hitler. Now, the repeal of the arms embargo occurred just in time. Winston Churchill became Prime Minister of Great Britain in May of 1940, and he cultivated a close relationship with FDR. Right after he became Prime Minister, Churchill wrote FDR a letter stating the needs of Britain. Britain was expected to be invaded by Hitler shortly, so Churchill writes a letter to FDR saying, I need these things, but here's what he asked for. He asked for 40 or 50 World War I era destroyers, hundreds of aircraft, anti-aircraft equipment and ammunition, and steel. FDR stated that he could not transfer destroyers to Britain without the authorization of Congress, but he would give Churchill the other things he requested. However, in late September 1940, so right before the election, FDR did find a way to bypass Congress and get the needed destroyers to Britain. He decided to exchange 50 World War I era destroyers in exchange for British naval bases in Newfoundland and Bermuda, and then also a 99-year lease on additional bases in the British West Indies. So this is the destroyers for bases deal. FDR accomplished this transfer through an executive order bypassing Congress, so it did raise the ire of Congress and American isolationism. Next time, we'll kind of look at FDR's re-election and then how we get dragged into World War II.